Several years ago, I taught through the book of Judges and tried to go through that completely. And it's been many years ago now, and I was thinking about maybe possibly going through this again, but doing it a little bit different, just doing one chapter a week. Last time, many times one chapter might take us 2 or 3 weeks, but just going through it a little bit at a quicker pace. And so we'll go ahead tonight. I'm not locking that in yet, but we're going to go ahead and start with Judges chapter 1 tonight. And so if you'll turn there, the book of Judges doesn't open up with a promise, but it does open up with victory. It opens up with a question here, verse number 1. It says, "Now after the death of Joshua it came to pass that the children of Israel asked the Lord, saying, Who shall go up for us against the Canaanites first, to fight against them?" As we're opening up the book of Judges here, it's a timeline of where we're at. Joshua's dead, so this great leader is gone. This generation that crossed over Jordan has aged, and now the people have to decide whether they're going to continue in obedience or settle for partial obedience and a partial victory that would come with that. And Judges chapter 1, now a lot of chapters in Judges is different. Chapter 1 is not about rebellion, but it is about incomplete obedience. Now, I've often said to my kids, delayed or partial obedience is immediate and complete disobedience. But that's really not what we're seeing here in the scripture. We are seeing just a kind of an incomplete obedience in them, that it's not like they're atheists. They believe in God, the God who led them this far. But what we see in the first chapter that we'll see all the way throughout is just a ton of compromise and blending in with the world that they've been called to be separated from. So it's not about necessarily, chapter 1 is not about a full turn away from God, but it's kind of a stopping short of where God wanted them to go. The tragedy of the book of Judges is not that Israel wouldn't ever turn back to the Lord or start things for the Lord. It's that they kept stopping and turning back around or stopping short of what he wanted for them. Israel would come back to God, and then suddenly they'd kind of forget about him again, and then there'd need to be another deliverer again. And they just kind of had this cycle over and over and over again. And Judges 1 kind of teaches us this truth, that God always keeps his promises, but God's people often fall short of listening to his commands and obeying them. And we see here this question at the beginning. They said, "Who shall go up for us against the Canaanites first to fight against them?" Verse 2, "And the Lord said, Judah shall go up. Behold, I have delivered the land into his hand." So Israel begins correctly. They don't immediately act. Joshua's dead. They don't vote. They don't strategize. They ask the Lord. Lord, right there it says, the children of Israel ask the Lord. They're saying, Lord, who should go up for us? Who should go up first? And that alone is commendable of Israel here. They ask not if they should go, but who should lead. So they knew they're supposed to go. God had already told them that previously. But now they're asking who should lead. So they're not saying we won't do it. They're starting with a question here. And God answers pretty clearly. He says, Judah shall go up. Behold, I have delivered the land into his hand. So God had already given them the land, but Israel still had to go and possess it. He says, Judah's going to go first. I have already delivered it into his hand. That basically is what he's saying is, I've already said that's what's going to happen. So Judah needs to go. A lot of times in life, God delivers, but he still expects us to do something. He still expects us to obey him. God's promises do not cancel human responsibility. Salvation is free. We've got to receive that. Then salvation is kind of fought for in the Christian life. Sanctification. After we receive salvation, sanctification doesn't just, we don't wake up in the morning and oh, now I'm spiritually mature and I'm ready for anything that this world sends my way. No, that's a part of us daily surrendering and submitting to him. So Canaan was promised, but Canaan had to be conquered. They still had to go in and do it. Now, this is already We know the stories of the spies and all these things. We know these things. This is already there in your mind a little bit about the story that God had promised them. And Caleb and Joshua said, hey, if God has promised us, I think the way they said they're like giants and we're like grasshoppers. And I think it's Caleb that goes on to say, since God has promised them, they're like meat for us, meaning that we'll eat these guys for lunch. Like if God said we're going to win, we don't have to wonder about the outcome. We need to just be obedient to what God has called us to do. I wrote down this statement: God does not fight instead of his people. He fights through his people. And we can't be lazy and then expect God to just take care of everything. And go, well, hey, God's in control. God's sovereign. That means I don't have to do anything. That's not what the sovereignty and the holiness of God teaches us. It teaches us because he's sovereign, I should obey him and I should listen to him. Many Christians ask God questions, but only when it's convenient. Israel didn't say, should we fight? Is this uncomfortable? Or what if we lose, God? No, they assumed obedience and they asked for directions. Who should go first? And some Christians ask God so they can decide if they're going to obey. God, what do you want me to do? Okay, I'll surrender to that. No, we ought to be surrendered to it and then say, Lord, tell me what to do. There's a big difference in saying, Lord, what do you want me to do? And in your mind thinking, so that I can decide if I'm going to do it, versus saying, Lord, I'll do whatever it is. Just tell me so that I can do it. It's a big difference. Israel asked God, how do we obey? Not should we obey, but how do we obey? Verse 3 here, and Judah said to Simeon, his brother, come up with me into my lot, that we may fight against the Canaanites, and I likewise will go with thee into thy lot. So Simeon went with him. So Judah immediately asked Simeon to join him. He said, come up with me. This is cooperation, not competition, which is probably rare for brothers. But he's like, let's come with me. Let's just do this. He didn't say, this is my land, stay out. And Simeon didn't say, well, Mr. Big Shot, you got picked to go in first. Then you go do it yourself. I believe that victory in our Christian walk many times does require unity among the brethren. I think that's part of why the Lord commands us to assemble together. That we ought to be able to come together to gain strength from each other. And God's work has always been done together. Moses needed Aaron, Joshua needed Caleb, Paul needed Barnabas, then he needed Silas, then he needed Timothy. And I believe that as Christians, we got to learn sometimes isolation makes us vulnerable. I can't tell you as a pastor how many times over the years I've heard, I don't have to go to church to be a Christian. I don't have to go to a church to still love the Lord. I don't have to go to church to stay in my Bible. I don't have to go to church. And on paper, that might sound fine. But in reality, I've watched it so many times that when people isolate themselves from church, when they have decided, and if you're watching online, I'm not talking about somebody who can't get to church. I know we've got some that watch us from a nursing home. I'm not talking about that. But those who refuse to go into church, and they just say, well, I'm just going to watch it through a TV screen. That's like akin to watching a fireplace on your screen at home. Yeah, you see the fire, but you didn't feel any warmth from that. You got nothing from it. And God has called us to unite together with other believers. It leads to vulnerability when we don't. This is not a solo act, and the devil loves it when Christians isolate themselves. And again, if you've been around here a while, you know I don't guilt people because you work on Wednesday night. You got a job that makes you have to work on Wednesday night. I believe that there are times where you just can't do that. You have to do obviously your first and foremost responsibility is to feed your family as a dad. I understand those things, but there's a difference between when we can't get there versus when we just decide that we don't need it anymore in our life. That we're so spiritually strong that we don't need it. Well, if you were actually spiritually strong, you'd realize that others might need you there. And that it helps with the accountability to one another. And the devil loves lonely Christians because isolated believers fall easier. Disconnected Christians will compromise quicker. And Lone Ranger Christianity is an unbiblical Christianity. And I don't believe church is optional for a believer. Not everybody has to come to this church, but I believe everybody ought to be assembling with like-minded believers to worship the Lord. And then we see God's power displayed. Verse 4 says, Judah went up, and the Lord delivered the Canaanites and the Perizzites into their hand, and they slew of them in Bezek 10,000 men. And they found Adonai-Bezek in Bezek, and they fought against him, and they slew the Canaanites and the Perizzites, but Adonai-Bezek fled, and they pursued after him and caught him and cut off his thumbs and with great toes, and his great toes. Very interesting verse right there. And Adonai-Bezek said, 70 kings, having their thumbs and their great toes cut off, gathered their meat under my table, as I have done. So God hath requited me. And they brought him to Jerusalem, and there he died. So Judah defeats the Canaanites and Perizzites. That's 10,000 men slain. And then comes this weird, in our mind, strange story about Adonai-Bezek, this pagan king. He had his thumbs cut off, he had cut off the thumbs and great toes of 70 kings. And then God turns the table on him here. He says, as I have done, so God hath requited me. It's a powerful statement from a lost man. God's justice doesn't forget, and so the thumb represents strength and skill and ability to wield weapons. The great toe represents balance and stability and mobility. This king had crippled others, so now God cripples him. Sometimes in life, God's justice doesn't come immediately, but it comes. No one sins forever without consequences, and sometimes even the lost. Have you ever noticed sometimes the lost recognizes God doing something before believers do? I've had lost people after major events happen in the world ask me, what do you think God is doing here? And then Christians be like, well, it was just coincidence. They fail to recognize what God is doing, but unsaved people. A lot of times when the children of Israel would go and God would do something, the people, they would come in or they'd go into a land, people would say, oh man, this is the Jewish people. Remember what their God did? Remember what their God did to that other country? We better be careful with this country. But Israel had seemingly forgot what God had done. God's people tend to forget and turn away quicker than any other people in the world. God's justice comes. Verse 8, we'll read a little good-sized portion here down through verse 20. We see that just because you have some success for a while doesn't guarantee continued success and obedience. So sometimes as parents or as a pastor or as if you're discipling somebody, you'll see some things and you're like, man, God is really doing something. This person's going to really, they're going to get on fire for the Lord. And then it's like a flash in the pan. Me and Brother Randy have talked about this before, about sometimes you go, man, if somebody would just go soul winning and they see somebody get saved. But then I've seen people come and go soul winning and see somebody get saved, and it's like in their brain, they're like, all right, got my one now. I'll be able to share that story forever. About that time I led that guy to the Lord, and then they have no interest in ever doing it. Just because God gives success doesn't guarantee that we're going to continue to obey him. In verse number 8, he says, now the children of Judah had fought against Jerusalem and had taken it and smitten it with the edge of the sword and set the city on fire. And afterward the children of Judah went down to fight against the Canaanites that dwelt in the mountain, in the south, in the valley. And Judah went against the Canaanites that dwelt in Hebron. Now the name of Hebron before was Kirjath Arba. And they slew Shishai and Ahiman and Talmai. And from thence he went against the inhabitants of Debir. And the name of Debir was Kirjath Sepher. And Caleb said, he that smiteth Kirjath Sepher and taketh it, to him will I give Ashath, my daughter, to wife. And Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, took it, and he gave him Achsah to his daughter to wife. And it came to pass, when she came to him, that she moved him to ask of her father a field. And she lighted from afar from off her ass, and Caleb said unto her, what wilt thou? And she said to him, give me a blessing, for thou hast given me a south land. Give me also springs of water. And Caleb gave her the upper springs and the nether springs. And the children of Kenite, Moses' father-in-law, went up out of the city of palm trees with the children of Judah into the wilderness of Judah, which lieth in the south of Arad. And they went and dwelt among the people. And Judah went with Simeon his brother, and they slew the Canaanites, inhabitants of Zephath, and utterly destroyed it. And the name of the city was called Hormah. Also Judah took Gaza with the coast thereof, and Askelon with the coast thereof, and Ekron with the coast thereof. And the Lord was with Judah, and he drave out the inhabitants of the mountains, but could not drive out the inhabitants of the valley, because they had chariots of iron. And they gave Hebron unto Caleb, and Moses said, and he expelled thence the 3 sons of Anak. Jerusalem's taken, Hebron's conquered, Debir falls, and Caleb promises his daughter to the man who captures the city. Aren't you glad I didn't make you capture a city, Teppo? But he says, if you want my daughter's hand in marriage, you've got to capture this city. So Othniel steps up, and this is like, revival-like momentum here. And she wisely asks for more land and springs of water. She wants fruitful ground, not barren ground. And good beginnings are wonderful, but they're not enough. You can start right and finish wrong. You can win early battles and then lose the war. You can defeat some enemies, but unfortunately have some that you don't defeat, and then you end up making friends with them. Make peace with them. God never asked them to try. He asked them to continue until they drive them out. And we start to see then in verse 21 the first signs of compromise. The children of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites that inhabit Jerusalem, but the Jebusites dwell with the children of Benjamin in Jerusalem until this day. In the house of Joseph, they also went up against Bethel, and the Lord was with them. And the house of Joseph went to cry Bethel. Now the name of the city before was Luz. And the spies saw a man come forth out of the city, and they said to him, show us, we pray thee, the entrance into the city, and we will show thee mercy. And when he showed them the entrance of the city, they smote the city with the edge of the sword, but they let go the man and all his family. And the man went into the land of the Hittites and built a city and called the name thereof Luz, which is the name thereof unto this day. So the tone starts to change. But they didn't drive out the Jebusites. That word at the beginning of verse 20 or 21 there, when it talks about not doing that, not doing that. That's a dangerous thing. We as Christians we need to make sure that we are doing what God tells us to do all the way. Sometimes it's like, we get so far. I don't know how many of you are project starters. I remember Brian Logston used to be a member here, and I remember talking to him and his wife one day, and she said, man, he is a great starter, and I'm a great finisher. So he does something for a good while. He gets the idea going, and I have to come in and finish it. And she kind of enjoyed wrapping up, and he would kind of do the big picture stuff. And a lot of people are like that. They get this big idea. They want to do all this stuff. I don't know if you've ever done any kind of home renovation. You get everything done, and you're like, I can wait a little while on the trim. I'm kind of tired. Then a year later, you're like, I still haven't put that trim. About 4 years ago, I tried to fix our island in the kitchen. Dawn got this idea. She wanted it all painted and a butcher block top on it. And so I did all this work getting that butcher block ready, painted all the cabinets, had to sand everything down. It was a real pain. And I still haven't put the quarter round down at the bottom. I've done everything else, and I told them, I even bought the quarter round, put it in the garage, and said, I'll get that like in a week or two. 4 years later, 5 years later, whatever it is, I ended up throwing the quarter round away because it got damaged after so much other stuff in the garage and different things. And so now I don't do it because I don't have any quarter round. Sorry, Don, I can't get to it. But no, that thing still hasn't had the trim done. And that's a problem in Israel here, where they start something, but they don't finish it. And partial obedience here enters the story. They allow the enemy to remain. And the results, it says, they dwell with them to this day. The enemy that they tolerated became later on the enemy that troubled them. It comes a troubling passage. A man from Bethel spared. Instead of destroying the enemy city, Israel makes a deal. And that man goes and builds another enemy city somewhere else. What you spare today often becomes stronger tomorrow. I've had several people over the years tell me, after I got saved, I got rid of this, I quit doing this, But there's this one thing. I remember one time somebody telling me they had gotten saved out of a pretty rough situation. Alcohol, some pretty rough drugs, some different things like that. And they said, but I just can't quit smoking. And this is what they told me. But I feel like I already made pretty good progress. I don't need to worry about that so much. I mean, look at how far I've come. And to a degree, they're right. We're all patting them on the back. Man, you're doing great. Man, you're doing awesome. And you know, they were up there with us in our church in Michigan, and they're not in church anymore. You know why? Because when you start to tell God no, that compromise becomes very easy to tell God no. What you spare today often becomes stronger tomorrow, and compromise always seems to reproduce. You ever notice you make a compromise with somebody, like you never get that back? It just always keeps getting you nudged more and more in that direction. So, yeah, you might have made a compromise and you brought them a little bit your way, but every time you make another compromise, you're getting further and further away from where you were originally at. That's how we have ended up with a lot of laws and things in our country, where we once had clear free market principles in our country. Over the years, little compromises after little compromises after little compromises has led to much more what would be defined as socialism in general in our country. Why? Because you never get those compromises back. You never get them back. You don't eliminate sin by thinking, I'll manage it. I'll just do it a little bit. I mean, we know this in principle. We would never tell somebody that has a pornography addiction, well, just cut it back to less than you're watching those things right now. We would never tell a crack addict, just try doing crack only on Saturdays. No, we would never tell them that. But all sin works that way. We need to starve it out. You eliminate sin by mortifying it. That's how you eliminate sin. The rest of this chapter is kind of a sad refrain. Verse 27, neither did Manasseh drive out the inhabitants of Beth-shean of her towns, nor Taanach and her towns, nor the inhabitants of Dor and her towns, nor the inhabitants of Ibleam of her towns, nor the inhabitants of Megiddo of her towns, but the Canaanites would dwell in that land. And it came to pass when Israel was strong that they put the Canaanites to tribute and did not utterly drive them out. Neither did Ephraim drive out the Canaanites that dwelt in Gezer, but the Canaanites dwelt in Gezer among them. Neither did Zebulun drive out the inhabitants of Kitron, nor the inhabitants of Nahalol, but the Canaanites dwelt among them and became tributaries. Neither did Asher drive out the inhabitants of Echo, nor the inhabitants of Zidon, of Alab, nor of Akzib, nor of Helbon, or of Aphek, or of Rehob. Those are fun things to try to rattle off real quick. But the Asherites dwelt among the Canaanites and inhabitants of the land, for they did not drive them out. Neither did Naphtali drive out the inhabitants of Beth-shemesh, nor the inhabitants of Beth-anath, but he dwelt among the Canaanites. And the inhabitants of the land, nevertheless, the inhabitants of Beth-shemesh and the Beth-anath became tributaries unto them. And the Amorites forced the children of Dan into the mountain, for they would not suffer them to come down to the valley. But the Amorites would dwell in Mount Heres of Aijalon and of Shalbim. Yet the hand of the house of Joseph prevailed, so that they became tributaries. And the coast of the Amorites was from the going up of Akrabim, from the rock and upward. So Manasseh doesn't drive them out. Ephraim doesn't drive them out. Zebulun doesn't drive them out. Asher doesn't drive them out. Naphtali doesn't drive them out. Dan was driven out instead. He gets put up in the mountains, so you can't even come down to the valley. You know what a lot of times will happen is somebody will use your compromise as an excuse for their compromise. You ever notice how many people say, well, you know, I know the Bible says we shouldn't do this, but so-and-so does this, and if that's okay, why can't this be okay? Well, they may not be okay. Who cares what they're doing? What does the Bible say? Well, you know, some people are changing this and they're changing that. We're not changing quite like that. No, we don't worry about what others are doing. We stay on the Word of God. God didn't fail. The enemy didn't overpower them. Israel just stopped short of what God wanted them to do. Notice the language change. Instead of driving them out, they put them under tribute. They became tributaries. So they learned to coexist with what God said to eliminate. And that really explains the rest of the book of Judges. When we think of all the messes that we will see in Judges, you think about, and I can't think of the man's name right now, but you think of the man that his wife was raped by someone and left her for dead there at his doorstep, and he cuts her up into 12 pieces and sends a part of her body to each tribe of Israel. This kind of wickedness started because they stopped short of doing what God called them to do. This is the Christian danger zone. Not, Lord, I'm doing nothing that you tell me to do, but that partial obedience. Not open rebellion, not apostasy, but tolerating sin. The stuff that we think, well, it's not that big a deal. If God calls it a big deal, it's a big deal. Oh, it's just a habit. You know, everybody struggles. And then the age-old, well, it's not as bad as this or bad as that. God never told Israel, hey, live with the Canaanites so that you can tax them and they can become tributaries of yours. He didn't say profit off of them. He said to drive them out, eliminate them. He said remove them. And partial obedience can sometimes, the most dangerous thing is partial obedience looks spiritual. We see it in our world today, partial obedience. I go to church every week. I dress up, I give an offering, I say amen, I sing in the church, I sing maybe even the choir, I may even teach a Sunday school lesson, but that might not be what God's called you to do. There definitely may be more than that. But I don't really have time to read my Bible every day. I don't really like to talk to people, so I don't ever share the gospel. The Great Commission wasn't a this is for some of you thing. It was for all of us. And so we say, well, I don't want that part. I want these other things. I like the part where I get to give a testimony how God blessed me. I don't like the part where I'm supposed to sacrifice. I don't like the part where I'm supposed to do my part. It sounds spiritual. It looks spiritual. It sounds reasonable, and it feels safer many times. But partial obedience is still disobedience. Saul lost his kingdom for sparing what God told him to destroy. Israel lost peace for sparing what God said to remove. What did they spare from these ones that stayed there? Idolatry. They spared an opportunity for their Israelite young people to marry people who did not believe in the same God that they believed. It led to a moral decay in their society. And eventually, immediately right here in chapter 1 for Dan, but for others, it leads to oppression for them eventually. Judges from chapter 2 on is a result of Judges chapter 1 for not fully obeying God. It explains chapters 2 through 21. Israel couldn't defeat the enemy by human strength alone, and neither can we. We have to realize, obviously, we came to Christ empty-handed. We got saved. But then we're supposed to put on the armor of God. You know why you put on the armor of God? Not to pose in a picture. It's to go to battle. It's to go to war. And a lot of Christians don't mind putting on the armor of God for an Instagram post. But that's not what we're called to do. We're supposed to go to battle for the Lord. And that cross was not partial victory. It's total victory. So a lot of Christians, though, end up living forgiven but defeated. Why? Because they don't fully surrender. They surrender the things that are socially unacceptable. Oh, I know I should quit doing this. I shouldn't act this way. I should clean myself up. They surrender those things. But many people stop short of full surrender to Him. So what we learn from this chapter is, first of all, starting off at the beginning again, we should ask God before we act. So God, I'm obeying you no matter what you tell me. But tell me, How should I do this? Not, Lord, tell me so that I can decide if I want to obey you. Secondly, remember, don't fight alone. Third, celebrate victories, but don't stop. Fourth, destroy what God says to destroy in your life. And don't make peace with what God hates. And finish your course. Finish the race that is before you. I'm 47 now, and unfortunately, as one who's been saved for many years now, been saved for over 30 years, I don't want to even think about trying to count it up to getting too old. But over 30 years of being saved, I've watched some people that finished really well. But I've also watched some people that had a great testimony for many years. Just in the last few years of their life, ruined their testimony. I wasn't a big reader of his or anything, but many of y'all may have seen the news this week of I guess lack of a better term, a Christian celebrity, an author, who I think he's 70-some years old and maybe even 80, and he confessed to an 8-year affair over the last 8 years and has ruined, in the eyes of many, the ability to listen to what he said. Even though what he said might have been biblical, it's ruined the testimony so much that it's tainted what he's written and what he said over the years. And I've watched a lot of people in the fourth quarter of their life just stop short of total surrender in their life. And that's what God's called us to do. Finish what he started. Maybe some of us need to deal with some unfinished obedience in our life. You didn't necessarily reject God. You're just not quite giving him all that you have. And I'm not even saying give all your effort. I'm not saying pull up your bootstraps. I'm saying surrender completely and just fall into him and say, whatever you want me to do. It's not about work harder, but it is to be more submitted and surrendered. He offers full forgiveness. He wants to give us full victory in this life as well. Don't settle for just coexisting with your sin and being like, well, nobody else will know about this, or it's not that big a deal. Whatever it is in your life that you think of in your mind, it's not that big a deal, it's a pretty big deal. I had somebody tell me one time they didn't want to come to our church because I preached that Christians should abstain from alcohol. And they said, I just don't think drinking alcohol is that big a deal. I said, good, then don't drink. If it's not that big a deal, don't drink. I found out it was a pretty big deal to them because they wanted to be able to drink and still serve in the church. It was a pretty big deal. And I said, you're going to leave and go to a church that doesn't just condone that. They also have a lot of other different doctrines. So that means you're putting alcohol above those other doctrines. Sounds like a pretty big deal. When we say something in our life that we know deep down we shouldn't be doing, and our response isn't this is right and edifying, the answer is it's not that big a deal. Oh, well, I was watching this in a movie and I was watching it on TV. It's not that big a deal. It's a big deal. I know me and Derek were talking a while back about how many things, just flipping our phone and scrolling through things, how many things come into our ear gate and songs and different things, or how many things, even if you flip off of it really quick, inappropriate things sometimes that might pop through in a reel or a YouTube short or something like that. Oh, it's not that big a deal. I'm mature enough, I can handle it. No, if we're mature enough, we just get a machete and cut that out of our life. And say, I'm not playing around with those things. And what we find is if we don't do that, we spend a lot more time in our life looking like the rest of Judges instead of that first half of chapter 1 where we're ready to obey the Lord. We've got to make sure we don't coexist with sin. When God offers conquest through Christ, that's the choice we ought to make, is to follow him. All right, we'll stop there. We'll take some prayer requests.